Well, so we've reached 3 minutes past the hour, and I think we can begin now as we've got quite a lot of people on the line. Welcome to this Cavell webinar, the multiple UC platform dilemma, why your UC strategy will fail without consolidation. Thanks everyone for joining today. Obviously, we're using the Microsoft Teams platform for the webinar. The Q&A panel is open, and we want this session to be as interactive as possible. So if you've got any questions at any point, please do submit them in the Q&A panel during the sessions, and we'll curate that, and we'll have a really good interactive session where I can put some of the questions to our expert guests. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Patrick Watson, Research Director here at Cavell. I'll be taking you through the majority of the session today, but I'm also joined by special guests from NetSapiens. First of all, Scott Goodwin, SVP for International Markets and Managing Director. Scott, how are you this afternoon?
I'm fine, Patrick. Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you with us. And also our Managing Director of Cavell, Matt Townend. Good afternoon, Matt. How are we?
Very good, Patrick. Looking forward to the debate.
Thank you both for joining us. So what we wanted to take you through today was some of Cavell's research and also an interactive discussion with Matt and Scott, looking specifically at providers that manage multiple UC and communication platforms and some of the potential issues and challenges that provides for providers in the market. This session will be available on demand for anyone who can't make it live, and also there will be, as a follow-up for everyone who registered, an additional piece of written content in the form of a paper where we'll deep dive into the topic in a bit more detail, which will be available for free for all of the attendees of the webinar today. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about the multiple UC platform dilemma? So at Cavell, we track a significant number of service providers globally. And one of the trends that we're seeing is that an increasing number of service providers end up managing multiple communication platforms. And that can be both an intentional decision in order to cater for customer demand, but also can be unintentional through merger and acquisition or additional technology convergence. And this can create a number of challenges, which we wanted to go over in the webinar today across both commercials and operational and logistical challenges. And one of the things we wanted to consider is, can consolidation of these communication platforms, so minimizing the number of internal platforms that a service provider or a telco utilizes internally, alleviate some of those challenges, create better margin and revenue opportunities, and also free up internal resource in terms of both personnel and infrastructure as well. So how big a problem is this? So as I said, at Cavell, globally, we track a really significant number of providers, primarily communication service providers who have multiple platforms that they're running. The graph on the left comes from our service provider data that we track globally of more than 1,000 service providers globally. And as you can see, more than half of them run more than one UC platform. And as I said, that can be intentional. And very often is in order to cater for customer demand. But in a lot of cases, as you can see, nearly 8% of those providers run more than 5 platforms. And in some cases, and I know both Matt and Scott will come onto this shortly in a minute, we've encountered providers who are managing more than 20 different platforms, and that causes a range of potential issues. This isn't just from the service provider perspective. We're also considering this from both resellers and managed service providers who end up accumulating bases as they look to acquire new end customers and effectively end up with a raft of different platforms that they aren't necessarily sure how to streamline and manage in the most effective way. One of the key factors that, Matt, I know I'm going to talk to you about shortly, is also investors who are responsible for financially supporting a lot of these firms, potentially looking for streamlining benefits, and have created businesses looking to create as much market share as possible, but end up with unconsolidated and often siloed communication platforms. This can often be the case in larger providers, and I think Scott and Matt, as we were talking when we were planning the webinar initially, actually this number here, it's a disproportionate proportion of the user base globally, because a lot of the larger providers are the ones that will operate multiple platforms. But it is an issue sort of across the market for service providers, managed service providers, and resellers of all sizes. So first of all, why is this happening? And I think what I wanted to take you through this, the slide on screen comes from some of our enterprise research. So for those of you who know Cavell, we survey tens of thousands of businesses every year about their adoption, preference, and use of technology. And one of the key trends that we've seen is that more and more businesses want to buy services, technology and communication services, from a single provider. And there's a number of rationales behind that from the enterprise perspective, but it's that principle of one back to pat in a good way, looking to one provider to provide as many converged technology services as possible. And effectively, providers want to be able to provide as many services to their customers as possible. It helps with customer retention, it helps with additional margin and revenue generation across different technology areas. One of the things we did want to talk about here, and Matt, I know that you had a key point on this, was larger businesses, end user businesses, often want to have best in breed technology. But this can also be a problem for smaller businesses where they're ending up running multiple platforms. So Matt, maybe if you could talk about a little bit about that in terms of the size of business.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen in the very large enterprise, obviously partners and service providers looking to provide, sometimes support the collaboration platforms which are present in those very large organizations. So there's a pressure to support Microsoft, Zoom, Cisco, etc. So we have seen at the very large enterprise that enablement model where we are seeing that. I think where the challenge comes even more is in the SME. So the SME, there's often a tendency to react to a customer requirement and just add another technology. And so in the SME, where there's less, focus necessarily on, that requiring that extension of those platforms and more around products and features and integrations, we find that the problem is almost more acute. That, when you've got multiple platforms you're running in the SME, that is driving more challenge than in the larger enterprise, where they may be supporting those big collaboration platforms. So I think there is there's some different shapes of the customer demand. In the smaller customer, they're less focused on some of those aspects and more focused on features, functions, integrations, the platform the service they want, than they are. It has to be, one of those collaboration enabled platforms. And in the large enterprise, yes, there is that pressure to have those. So I think there is this kind of, difference in the requirement. And, so when the SME provider has multiple platforms, it's harder, and we're going to discuss that in more detail, to serve that requirement from the SME if they've got multiple platforms.
Yeah, there's a number of drivers sort of coming at this, and as you said, it's different from each sort of individual business and what segment they're in and what they're looking. Scott, from the NetSapiens side, are you seeing sort of technology convergence as well as one of those key things that's driving sort of platform addition?
Yeah, I think so. I think the industry, we serve service providers of all shapes and sizes. Those service providers have grown through either acquisition or through organic growth. Many of them came from, I guess, their communication standpoint was a kind of PBX background originally. Those PBXs, kind of back in the day, were capable of, I guess, doing a lot of different bespoke routings depending on client requirements. And that, I think, has caused some fragmentation, I guess, across service providers when serving SMEs. But to Matt's point, it's certainly a problem that is more focused around the small to mid-sized businesses.
So we've got, when we're asking why is this happening, why are providers building up this sort of multiple UC platform? So we've got this idea of technology convergence that in some cases is driven by enterprise demand. But I suppose the other key factor here is is M&A activity, and that in combination with technology convergence is causing this potential significant roll up of businesses and accumulation of different platforms. And Matt, I wanted to come to you on this shortly, but we talked about the sort of amplified focus in the SMB sector, but a lot of these the businesses that are either investing in acquiring customer bases by making acquisitions of other businesses, or investors that are funding businesses to expand and try and grow their individual customer base and their revenue streams. We saw a really significant amount of M&A activity, even though with the economic downturn there was a little tip down in that, but hundreds of deals in the sector, with businesses looking both for technology-based acquisitions but also customer-based acquisitions. And that has driven partially this problem of the UC platform roll up. And Matt, I wanted to ask you, because I know you deal with investors a lot. A lot of the time when they're considering funding merger and acquisitions, they're potentially looking for platforming streamlining benefits that aren't necessarily always realized. And I know we'll come on to that, but streamlining benefits is one of the sort of rationales behind the roll-ups.
And I think it's changed as well. So if we look back 3 or 4 years ago, from an M&A point of view, it was growth at all costs. So companies will get being rewarded from a valuation point of view from a growth perspective, and now that's changed to a profitability aspect. So at one point, people would buy bases, would buy service providers, would buy other, and wouldn't necessarily worry about some of the lack of synergies coming through, because they weren't necessarily focused on that. They were focused, the value for their business was coming through that top line growth. So, adding new recurring revenue customers was fine, and we can solve that problem another day. But what you've seen now, certainly in the UK, but also other markets, is a lot of the major MSP roll-up players have had a pause, because basically their investors have realized, and they knew it originally, that actually they're going to be rewarded better for profitability than they are for pure growth. So there has been a change in the last year, I would say. If anybody was to look at, for not just UK but other markets, but if you looked at the UK, the major MSP roll-ups have all slowed down to some degree as that focus and change has come through. So I think that's an important factor that's affected investors' attitude to synergies, that they, as you say, Patrick, they are looking for now, where can I get that profitability?
So it's that shift partly from a valuation perspective, isn't it? From a purely a growth metric to an EBIT metric.
Yeah, that's driving a lot of the behaviour, and I think whilst there's a lot of pressure coming onto businesses.
And Scott, from the sort of businesses that you're coming across, that you're talking about a consolidation journey, is a lot of those businesses accumulating platforms through M&A activity?
Yeah, I mean, I think this roll-up's been going on for years. I mean the interest. I mean, there's a lot of complexity in our business, as we all know. A lot of moving parts that are there, but ultimately the business model itself is infinitely simple, and it's an economies of scale game. If you can control your overheads and pour as many more customers in the top of the funnel, and manage those in as frictionless way as possible, these things should be very cash generative, and that's why investors, were so keen to pour money into it. It's contracted income. It tends to be relatively immune to economic upswing or downswing. It's a productivity promise. Tends to do well when there's economic hard times as well. I mean, I think it's still attractive for all of those reasons. But in order to run these businesses efficiently, you have to do that in as automated way as you possibly can, and you have to bring to bear economies of scale. And that's, and I think that's some of the points that we're going to come on to about, why haven't those things realized? From Matt's point, there's people been going on that's been acquiring and growing and doing the top line stuff. But we've probably reached that point now where that degree of focus needs to be brought to bear to really start to bring efficiencies to bear.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned complexity, because I wanted to come on to that in the next couple of slides. So we talked about the why this is happening. So you've got technology convergence, you've got multiple M&A drivers that we've listed on the slide here, and M&A causing this sort of UC platform accumulation. So technology convergence driven by enterprise demand, M&A activity within the market. So you mentioned complexity there, Scott, and my sort of exam question there was, is managing multiple platforms a problem? And what I wanted to highlight here on this slide, and I realise for everyone on the call, this is a busy slide. This is something that we looked at, Cavell, many years ago in terms of trying to map what a telco or a communication service provider business might look like in terms of technology provision. And you get this incredibly complex picture across a range of different business applications, telco network, and also telco applications. And these siloed systems don't necessarily integrate easily into one another. And I think the key pieces that we wanted to highlight here were highlighted in green on the left, were the pieces of the systems that should run seamlessly across the different technology systems. So your OSS, BSS systems, portals, supporting services, your analytics and intelligence capability, your data flow across these systems, and then the integrations between them. And I think, as busy as this slide is, it doesn't even quite get across the almost 5D chess nature of the problem, because not only have you got this very complex potential technology ecosystem, you're maybe also managing 5 or 10 different unified communications platforms as just one segment of this diagram. So I think the key problem is the focus on those supporting areas. And Scott, you mentioned automation before. That's one of the hardest things to do, isn't it? First of all, in this whole ecosystem, but then if you've got additional layers of multiple UC or contact center platforms on top of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a compound problem here. Is the more moving parts that you have, they become exponentially difficult to be able to integrate into it. And I guess Matt will talk about, I guess, the direction of travel in terms of which we're moving to. But you are seeing in the industry a commoditization of basic UCaaS services. The promises that we are seeming to make as an industry is that margins will be somewhat offset by the development of vertical integrations or vertical solutions that are data driven, that are providing big productivity outcomes. I think Matt's coined a phrase about the intelligent workplace that we're seeking to develop, which are going to bring enormous benefits to end users and the service providers that can make those leaps. However, in order to be able to reach that kind of new dawn of propositions, you are going to have to be incredibly capable in the way that you orchestrate these solutions together. And I think that's one of the other things that's going to drive people's decisions to start to rationalize in those areas, because you've got to control those moving parts when you're starting to build automated solutions that are driving the kind of data outcomes that we're looking for.
Yeah, I was going to add one point, Patrick, which is, what we're seeing now, when we are seeing roll-ups happen in the space, and there's still people obviously looking to build capability, broader capability to serve that customer requirement. We're seeing an OSS BSS first approach. So actually the development of the OSS BSS is some of the first steps, rather than before, you would, that may be the back end of the strategy rather than the front end of the strategy. So some of the businesses that we're now seeing who are coming to market are really focusing on that. So I think that transition is pretty interesting as well.
And that's key, isn't it, ultimately for optimization and efficiency? You know, if you take it from that approach, ultimately you're, as a business, more able to, you know, sort of seamlessly manage across those different systems, rather than you says as a sort of more difficult retrofitting exercise.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the sort of complex 5D chess example of what an ecosystem might look like, with some of these duplicated systems. If you're running, as we've seen examples of at Cavell, you know, 20 plus UC systems, as well as all of the other pieces within this network topology. But there are also other key operational problems from managing multiple partners, and these are just some of the examples that we've come across from a Cavell perspective. We talked about the cost of management of these different systems, you know, being able to manage across the various different platforms. Resources and skills shortage within the industry is something that we hear as a regularly recurring problem, particularly, and Scott, you made the point previously about legacy PBX systems being incorporated into some of these infrastructures. A lot of those historic skill sets are gradually moving out of the market. You know, do you have the skill set within your organization to support a legacy system? And are there any new engineers, you know, either on the technical side or salespeople capable of selling that in terms of a resources and skills point? You also mentioned the integration capability across those different platforms. How easy is it to integrate into those legacy platforms? How seamless can you make that integration? And then ultimately, how does that affect end customer experience if the systems and Matt, to your point, the OSS BSS systems aren't integrated on the back end? And as we were talking when we were planning this webinar, one of the things that I neglected to include on this slide was vendor management. So if you're managing 20 UC platforms, you're managing relationships with 5 or 10 vendors who might all be trying to talk to you about the latest developments and upgrades and wanting you to look at their platform in particular. So there's a vendor management problem as well in terms of the time and resource that takes. That's as well as key things across support and SLA disparity across different systems. If you want to offer a ubiquitous system to your customers, but yet they're running on a variety of different systems, how can you standardize on support offerings and your service level agreements? And then, Scott, you mentioned the intelligent workplace, which we'll come on to, which I think is a key piece. We're seeing increasing focus from Cavell on our enterprise research about the rising importance of security within communications, particularly with the focus that we're seeing on data around AI. And how can you ensure security across all of these different systems when they're all running off different bases? And I think that's a sort of key decision. The final piece I wanted to mention here is a very poor ex-salesperson myself was sales confusion. You know, if you run in a business, and your salespeople aren't entirely sure what is the primary platform they should be selling, are their commission structures best aligned to your business outcome and goals? And I think these are just a few of the operational issues that businesses encounter when they're managing these multiple platforms. And Scott and Matt, I know that you've been involved in lots of businesses like this, and Scott, I'll come to you first on this. Just from a sort of management issue, this is a big potential headache and a lot of resource you have to put into this.
Yeah, enormous. I mean, these are all points of friction, aren't they? So not only are they points of friction which will delay things, you know, in terms of getting speed to market, reacting to particular issues and all of those kind of things, they're incredibly costly. But more often than not, what happens in those situations where you've got that degree of complexity, everything gets dragged down to the lowest common denominator. So you don't end up rising to a challenge or offering something that is you know, substantially better that's in the market. You offer something that is a compromise of a compromise, because it's easier to do that and actually get and make one step forward. And I think the ones that manage to crack this, the ones that manage to choose their platforms carefully, you know, obviously have to be API centric at the core of them as well. That allows them to be able to consolidate in a frictionless way as possible. I think these are, going to be key decision points that are made.
That's the key challenge. And Matt, I know you've obviously dealt with a lot of businesses from the sort of M&A advisory perspective, where these sort of operational issues put a lot of strain on the management of a business, and often the management of these different systems is sort of duplicated as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of due diligence, and as you know, and I quite often find that we've had massive growth in product catalog. So businesses are suffering with such a bloated product catalog now, thousands and thousands of SKU codes, and that just causes massive challenges to those businesses as they look at kind of where they're going next. But we'll come on to the challenge. A lot of people on the call will recognize some of these challenges, I'm sure. But that is very, very regular for me to see now is a lack of product management discipline, a lack of real how are we going to a proper process for retiring products quite often is lacking. And it's not business's fault. It's because of the focus has been on growth. So this bloated just product catalog is very common, and it also puts off investors when we're looking at kind of how people are going to move these businesses forward. The other thing is billing systems. So the one thing that puts shivers down my back is when anybody talks about billing migrations and how I'm going to bill for all these different services. So it's those sorts of things where there's real tangible problems by having these bloated product catalogs.
Do you think there's also sorry, Patrick, I'm going to say, Matt, do you think there's also a sort of small denial around, well, we don't really do, they don't switch things off because the feeling is it doesn't really have a great deal of cost associated to it. It sort of hums away there in the background, but it's actually acting as a sort of drag along the business because, one turns into two turns into four, and it's just compromised really.
Yeah, and I think the cost is not obvious. The costs aren't necessarily tangible. Some of these platforms might have been completely depreciated. So there isn't necessarily an obvious financial cost. So when the finance team comes to town on cost cutting, it's not always the most obvious place to look. So yeah, I think that's very relevant. Valid.
Well, you two perfectly segued in by talking about cost there to what, and as you said, there's a hidden costs of managing a lot of these platforms that might not necessarily appear on the sort of bottom line or the top line. But we know one of the main problems that service providers are facing, and this is the graph that everyone can see on screen here, and Scott, you mentioned it previously, is the increasing commoditization and competitive nature of the UCaaS markets. And this comes from our service provider research from 2024, which saw a significant number of the service providers that we have spoken to have seen a reduction in margin and revenue on UCaaS over the past 12 to 36 months. So they're getting squeezed on the top end in terms of the product. And then, as you said, you've got all of these potentially hidden costs on the bottom end of managing UC platforms. So the reason I wanted to put this up here, Scott, and we talked about it previously, is that you've got the sort of revenue margin being squeezed at the top end, and then all of these hidden costs from managing multiple platforms on the sort of bottom end. And
it's that kind of pincer movement that causes a compelling event, isn't it? It's I mean, margin is a combination of obviously the direct profit that you're making from the actual services itself, but the control of an overhead as well to serve that particular product. And I think as you find, and I guess we shouldn't lose sight of the direction of travel in which we're going is one of the ways that the industry talks about battling commoditized margins is by moving to this new dawn of vertical integrations and productivity enhancements, and AI always comes into that conversation about how you're going to drive value and get new money from customers on top of, a basic communication service. But in order to do that, you also have to rationalize your underlying systems in order to be able to, deliver those at a decent cost. And these are the complexities that we now face.
Yeah, and that, Matt, to Scott's point, that's a really key piece, because it is effectively a vicious cycle that we're seeing here, as sort of traditional telecoms UCaaS revenues are reducing. Providers look to add additional value-added services or a new technology area that might have a better sort of revenue and margin stream, and you get this sort of never-ending cycle that Scott was talking about in terms of expansion of those different product sets, and maybe exacerbation of the problem in terms of multiple UC platforms and comms platforms.
Yeah, and I think it's why it's going to be compelling. So why we are having this webinar now is lots of people potentially are aware of this problem, and some of the things that we've talked about won't necessarily be completely rocket science. But I think it came out of a discussion that me and Scott had, actually, and Scott said, well, we'll be keen to support that, because we're seeing that and we're trying to address that as a business. This challenge, as we look at this new era of verticalization, of AI, how can we do that with such a fractured existing product estate? So you've got margin pressure, you've got cost pressure, and you've got to go in a new direction. So I think we're kind of at that compelling period right now that we can't necessarily put off some of those decisions that have been put off. And we're going to talk about why, but I think that's what's making this compelling right now.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on the next slide. Again, this comes from our service provider research. And Scott, I wanted to come to you on one of the pieces here, but this was asking, again, our service provider audience what their primary investment focuses were. And the one that came back on top was automation and integration, which we've already talked about as a sort of key challenge in siloed, duplicated systems. That is a significant investment for service providers in terms of trying to automate and integrate. But Scott, you made the point in planning as well. It completely relates to various points on this chart in terms of those investment areas, in terms of providing better customer experience. And we talk about AI. If you can't, and we'll come onto the data in the systems as well, if you can't consolidate data across these systems, you can't realize a number of those sort of key investment points.
No, totally. You've got to have a complete view of your customer in order to produce great customer experiences, and you can't lose the data. Otherwise, you're only seeing a mosaic, I guess, of what the customer is, and you can't build great solutions. I mean, we saw probably 2 years ago, I think it was the Arizona UGM when we released our new API 2.0, which was required, because you could clearly see that was the direction of travel, is that you had to basically give complete open access to your partners in order for them to be able to write into the platform and create their own compelling offers, really, and integrating that with other third-party solutions. So we saw that several years ago and started to make those changes because that was clearly the way that the industry was moving.
Yeah, I think that openness, the integration capability is absolutely key. And what that's led us to are these core business drivers from a service provider perspective that we've covered off in the why this is a problem. They're looking for operational efficiency and cost savings. To your point, Scott, they want to be able to make data-driven decisions across the stack. But if you can't see the data from different siloed systems, you can't unify that together and get a full picture. And then the final piece, in terms of being able to offer compliance and security enhancements across your entire stack, is difficult across a siloed technology estate, even more so when it's duplicated or multiplied. And I think, Matt, that leads into the concept that we talked about our Cavell Summit EU, which was Cavell's concept of the intelligent workplace. And this is what we're seeing from a new enterprise technology estate, where businesses have these core central drivers that they want to be able to communicate, collaborate, and analyze. They've got a set of core business systems, which include communication systems such as UCaaS, CCaaS, their CRM systems, productivity applications. And these all need to be able to integrate seamlessly in order to provide the data that flows across the entire sort of enterprise technology estate, the integrations between all of those different applications so that the data can flow. And the sort of in vogue phrase of the last 18 months or in initialism has been AI, and you can't really get a true AI picture if you can't get that across your whole estate. And then this security and compliance wrap around the outside from an end customer perspective. Matt, do you think it's possible to offer end customers this concept of the intelligent workplace if you're running as a service, as a communications technology provider, a service provider, a very sort of disparate estate on this?
I think it makes it very tricky. And we put data number one here, which is kind of interesting. So the data is positioned on the top of this because it powers everything else. So if you can't get data running between platforms, you've got a challenge. Now, the other thing is, the other discussion, and we talked about it a bit earlier, is can you do intelligent workplace solutions often end up being verticalized because of the nature of that vertical requires you to integrate with certain tools and certain capabilities, and the users have a different requirement. So yeah, I mean, it would be you could do a specific platform for a specific vertical, but it would be suboptimal in terms of the way you do that. So I mean, this is really the crux of why Cavell believes that the dilemma that's been put off by the industry really for a long time is going to come now to roost, and people are it is really gonna come to roost now, and people have got to make decisions, because we believe customers are going to start to demand more and more intelligent solutions. They're not going to just buy a siloed UCaaS capability. They are going to want it integrated. They are going to want it and different customers will have focus on different systems. So some of the CRM will be the most important thing. So we're not necessarily saying this is just a UCaaS world, but so I think it drives that thought pattern in businesses. We've often sort of just thought of comms as a separate universe, really, and now we've got to think of it in a broader context, I think.
Yeah, and I think what we're thinking about here from the Cavell perspective is the market maturing in terms of the customer requirement, and that has to be mirrored in the capability of technology providers in order to enable that. And we're coming to the Q&A session. So if anyone's got any questions for Matt or Scott or about the research, please do submit them in the Q&A or the chat panel. You might have noticed as a webinar attendee that there's been a bit of an omission during this presentation, and this is a slide that I've stolen from previous Matt Townend presentations, that there's a bit of an elephant in the room that we haven't yet talked about, and that is fear of customer churn. And is that ultimately why we don't see more consolidation of UC platforms? And Scott, you mentioned previously that a lot of systems sit there and they've got some users on, and those users are perfectly happy and those end businesses are perfectly happy. Why take that risk to move them onto a new platform if it even brings up the possibility of a contract discussion or renewal? So are we talking about sort of fear of customer churn as potentially the sort of main inhibiting factor here?
It's a significant factor, not to be ignored. I mean, it is the elephant in the room. It is. But I guess to me, it's something to the previous points. It's something that has to be addressed now, which is you can't make it to the other side of this journey without having simplified your capabilities in order for you to be able to deliver frictionless services in whatever format, verticalized or kind of on a mass broad market. The fewer things that you've got in there, the better. One of the the challenges in doing that is, you're going to have to contact your customers, and there may well be some compromise that is having to done to migrate a customer off one platform onto another. Whether that's kind of feature loss or feature enhancement or whatever it would be. There is some customer interaction that would do. How you can limit that, I think that if you can almost make it imperceptible in terms of how their existing service operates today, and how you can move that into a centralized environment moving forward, I think that absolutely enhances your opportunity to migrate customers en masse and not really have to worry too much about what the repercussions of that might be. Because again, a lot of these platforms that people will have had for years, they've become quite used to it. If you're then starting to talk about the removal of devices from one device type to another, there's huge cost associated with that, and then there's disruption with it. There's particular kind of short codes, dial codes that people have in the way that it's been set up on their solution. If it starts to change, that causes disruption for the end users. And I think the really interesting point about this is the people that are having to do the migration, the nuance of this, is it's the very same people that are supporting customer growth and customer acquisition. So when they're looking at migration programs, they're doing these things usually in the margins of their day-to-day jobs. And that is scary for many of them. To be how am I going to fit these things in? I'm putting in 200 extensions a month. If you're looking at migrating 4,000 extensions that exist there already, how are we going to be able to do that? And being able to do that in automated, low risk, but consequently with low repercussions from end users, because nothing's really changed, becomes a significant part of that equation when taking those decisions.
Yeah, so I wanted to highlight that as a sort of key piece of the puzzle. I can see we've had quite a lot of questions come in from the audience, so we've got a good amount of time left, and what I wanted to do is sort of have a bit more of an interactive Q&A. So as I said, any more questions, you can submit them either in the chat panel or the Q&A, and we'll put them to Matt and Scott. So I think, and Scott was going into it there, Matt, why do you think we've got to this stage now where providers haven't consolidated their platforms?
I think it's really the factors we've talked about through the presentation. So firstly, businesses weren't being rewarded. They were being rewarded for growth. They weren't necessarily being rewarded at a value perspective. And it sounds like a stupid thing to say, but they weren't being valued for profitability. And that has changed. So, I mean, I think that drives behavior, right? So businesses go out and they like everybody, they follow that driver. I think also there hasn't been good tools. So one of the challenges, there hasn't necessarily somebody made a point in the chat about, one of the issues is, how easy is this to do, or the perception that this is pretty difficult. So we've generally seen cap and grow strategies where people have capped bases and grown on new platforms and kind of put the problem to one side and just left. You've ended up with this happening. Or they've tried to bring a new feature, but it's not been a need. They've tried to convince somebody to move because there's superior capability, which is obviously a strategy as well. But it hasn't been a good, easy. There hasn't been the good migration tools that I think has been one of the big challenges.
And Scott, would you agree with that on the sort of migration tools and, some of those barriers as to why, we haven't seen this consolidation that's on sort of more of a widespread basis?
Yeah, I mean, completely. I mean, none of these are kind of secrets, are they? I think we've all known this as an industry. As I say, I can completely understand why these things haven't happened. I think the compelling event that Matt was talking to is that you've got commoditization in core services and a need to basically bridge the gap to go to these new pastures that require these challenges to now be addressed. So I think this is the compelling event that we're talking about. But the reasons why are long and nuanced. I mean, again, there's a political, kind of people thing here about, some individuals have got, deep expertise in a particular type of technology that often puts internal resistance against any kind of form of change that you would have. That there are people, processes, and systems complexities to all of this. But an inevitability, if you're going to make it to the other side, these things are now needing to be addressed.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions in the chat. One from Adrian: are you seeing more larger customers allowing more choice to users and offering sort of multiple UC offerings? So I think Matt touched on that at the beginning. So occasionally we do see very large enterprise businesses who want to offer a multiple UC strategy, but additionally, generally it's only very large service providers who are catering to the large end of the market that want to offer a variety of best in breed. There is an element of customer choice, but I would say that is generally highlighted towards the sort of top end of the market there.
I would, Patrick, also to build on that point, I think there is a very logical enablement strategy at the large enterprise with the large collaboration platforms. You need to offer those. In the SME, what is often driving it is you are more focused on the margin, the price pressure's higher. So you've been pushed, pushed is the wrong word, but it's been more, you've more wanted to run your own infrastructure because you've had, you have margin pressures, and you can drive some of that out by having your own platform infrastructure and capability. So I think certainly in the SME, it's a slightly different picture, not only from the customer need, but there's also a very compelling case, and Scott will agree as one of the platform providers in the SME to be running your own platform, from a margin perspective, and so there's a different piece at play. In the large enterprise, you're probably hands up. You're going to come across Microsoft, hands up. You're going to have to integrate with those things. You're going to have to take those on board, and you're probably going to give up margin as a result. But you're probably realizing it's kind of inevitable. But maybe at the smaller business, there's a slightly different focus there is a different focus in terms of the customer requirement. So you're more likely to be wanting to run platforms and to drive margins and to drive your own innovation, etc. So I think that's also at play, slightly different position.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would just also build on that as well. I totally agree, Matt, in terms of SMEs, is that providers should have their own platform, control their own destiny, develop their own products. The generations of today don't care what brand it is either. Is that, I think in the days where you had to have a kind of big brand, and the telcos would invest tens of millions of pounds in telling you that whether it was Cisco or whatever was the thing to have. They don't care now. They just want it to work, and they want it to be a value creating solution. But outside of SMEs, what you're also seeing is, particularly in government deployments as well, you've got a very eclectic deployments that are out there, with procurement cycles as they are. You've got local and central government with larger states with a sock drawer of technology that's there, all of which they're having to sweat their assets at the edge as much as they can. There's no monies to really look at, but they also want to take control of those things. They want to start to get some centralization, some management of it, and some insight across that platform. And again, those are opportunities for certain service providers running the right technology.
And Scott, from the sort of NetSapiens perspective, when you're talking to customers about this, when you're talking to service providers about this, what's the sort of key focus? How do you overcome? Where do you start in terms of platform consolidation?
You try and basically kind of look at the fundamentals of this, which is our service providers tend to outperform other service providers not running a NetSapiens platform because they have greater control. They have access to an API where they can orchestrate anything on it. In terms of migrations, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is the ability to clone existing solutions and bring them under centralized control. It's a multi-tenant platform. You can host it on your own infrastructure, or you can host it on one of our cloud solutions that we've partnered with Oracle on. You've got control with a NetSapiens platform, and I think that resonates with lots of people, be they in large state government deployments or service providers that are seeking to differentiate and take their customers along a journey rather than just buy in something that everybody else is selling.
I think we've answered most of the questions on the chat, and we're coming to the end of the session today. I just wanted to say, first of all, a massive thanks for everyone in the audience for joining and submitting your questions. As part of participation for the webinar today, you will be able to get the webinar on demand, so you can share with any sort of team members or colleagues who weren't able to attend today. And within the next coming couple of weeks, you'll also get a white paper on the same topic, where we've utilized a bit of Cavell's proprietary research to outline some of the things that we've talked about today in terms of the multiple UC platform dilemma, how much of a problem this is, why it's happening, what are some of the obstacles, and how do you potentially overcome that. We'd also love your feedback on the session today, so you can scan the QR code on screen and provide feedback, primarily for the presenter, myself, but for any follow-up information. If you've got any questions on any of the Cavell research, please do reach out to me. My email's on screen there, or you can head to cavell.com to see the research. And additionally, if you want to understand more about what NetSapiens are doing, the migration tools that Scott talked about, and what they're doing in this space to try and help service providers alleviate that, you can obviously head to netsapiens.com or email Scott. But for the session today, it's just lastly from me, thank everyone for attending, and big thank you for joining me, Matt. Thanks for coming on the session today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks to NetSapiens for helping us put this on. We appreciate your support.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. And Scott, yeah, thank you for coming on, and for NetSapiens for supporting the session.
My pleasure, Patrick, as always. You too, Matt.